Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Scamell. I'm going to be doing my talk, do the Loco-MotionLayout. Who here has heard of MotionLayout? Okay, who's used it? Okay, that's good. Anyone used it for something complex, anything crazy? No? Okay, cool. So just a heads up for anyone who has used it, my talk is primarily aimed at beginners, but you might find something in here that you didn't know about. This isn't going to be a deep dive into MotionLayout. No matter what you see, this isn't a deep dive. Rather than telling you about all the features of MotionLayout up front and then trying to cram in about how to build something, we're going to build something straight from the get-go and learn about it along the way. So there are blog posts by Nicholas Rouard and John Hawford, which go into way more detail than I can. There'll be links to these at the end. So what we're going to do is actually quite a lot to take in, and despite my best efforts, there is a chance you might get overwhelmed. Okay. And now we have to wait.
I'm so sorry, Red Channel. The main stage has got some important announcement which they have to say to us. That's why a few minutes of waiting, please.
We're all good now, and that's a very loud man. Okay, so back to my talk. TLDR, for those of you who've just joined, we're doing Loco-MotionLayout. It could get overwhelming, but just try and follow along. In the bottom right-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner of the slides, I've referenced the activity which this is going to relate to in the repo that you'll see a link to at the end. So you can quite easily go back, watch this again, and look at the code at the same time. So let's get started. So this is the animation we're going to be trying to recreate, or most of the animation that I could do anyway. I saw this on Dribbble, and when I was browsing through it, and I was like, oh, this will be a good candidate to put MotionLayout through its paces. There's quite a lot happening, as you can see. So what is MotionLayout? MotionLayout is a subclass of constraint layout, so if you're familiar with that, then you'll be familiar with MotionLayout. It also has a min SDK of 18, which is Jelly Bean MR2. I tried to think of the best way to describe MotionLayout, but I think Nicholas Rouard, co-creator of MotionLayout, probably did it best. He says that MotionLayout is a mix between the property animation framework, layout transitions, and coordinator layout. So MotionLayout is really powerful. It's great for user interaction and animating while also being fully declarative, meaning we can describe it all in XML. So it sounds like a really good candidate for that last animation we just saw. Oops, sorry. Now, normally I'd hope you'd have access to the designer who created your animation, and you can then ask him about how to set things up and where things should fade in. I didn't, so I had to break this all down myself. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through this and break it all down. So let's start by focusing on the animation where the no longer human book cover rotates and moves down the screen. And just ignore everything else for now. So first we need a book cover. So let's just put this in a constraint layout for now. So here we've set up all the constraints in our layout to put the book cover just off center of the screen. If you've used constraint layout before, and I really hope you all do because it's great, then this should all look familiar. And this is what it looks like. All pretty simple right so far, but it's not going to animate, and that's where MotionLayout comes in. So all we need to do is to make sure we're using constraint layout 2.00 alpha 3, put that in our Gradle file because constraint layout is already there, right? As mentioned before, MotionLayout is a subclass of constraint layout, and because of that, it means we can just swap the constraint layout declaration for a MotionLayout declaration. So, all simple so far, right? And if we run it, the dreaded null pointer exception. It's because we're missing a MotionScene. How convenient. A new concept I haven't explained to you yet. It's almost like I planned it. Okay, so let me explain to you what a MotionScene is. A MotionScene is an XML file that lives in the XML directory in your resources folder. This is our MotionScene file. I think of the MotionScene as a bit like a director. The director knows how certain parts of the film are going to play out and in what way. He also knows how to go from one part to the other. You describe how you move from one part to the other, using transitions. A transition can have certain attributes. It has an ID. It can have a start constraint set, like we're defining here, which tells it all the constraints it needs to use for the start of the transition. It also has a constraint set end, which defines what the layout's going to look like at the end of the transition. There are other attributes you can set for it. For example, you can set an interpolator, but these are the three attributes that we're going to use for now. So we have our transition, but we need something to drive it. With motion layout, we have two options, a swipe handler or a click handler. We're going to look at the swipe handler and come back to the click handler later. The swipe handler has a lot of attributes, so let's go through the things you're most likely going to be using all the time. Firstly, we have the drag direction, which defines the direction of the motion we're tracking. In our case, that's going to be down. We have the touch anchor ID, which references the object that the movement will be relative to. If we omit this from the layout, then the movement will be relative to the X and Y of the motion layout. The touch anchor side defines the side of the object which should track your finger. In this case, we're saying the bottom of our book cover should track our swipes. There are a few other attributes we could use, such as max acceleration or drag scale, but we're going to keep it simple. We've got a lot to do. So here's a quick example of using a drag handler. We have our book cover, which is our touch anchor, and we have our touch anchor side, which is the bottom. So when we drag down the screen, the bottom of the book cover moves down, and motion layout tries to keep the distance between the bottom of the book cover and our touch the same. We use constraint sets to define how we want things to look at the start and the end of a transition. You could have intermediary steps like a middle state, but whatever it is ideally a natural resting point before moving to the next state. We're going to focus on just having a start and end state for our first scene, just to keep things simple. This is our start constraint set. A constraint set is a lot like using constraint layout, but there are a few differences worth noting. The type for the book cover is not an image view, like we would have in our layout. It's a constraint. This constraint will apply to the book cover that we've defined in our layout. Any constraints here will override the ones that are in our layout. For example, if in our layout we set the height and width to 1 dp, then, in the constraint we set it to 300 dp, it's going to use what's here, 300 dp. Within the constraint object, we can have a number of sub-elements. Here you can see that we're using the layout and transform sub-elements. There's also property and motion sub-elements. Layout is for all the attributes define how you want your view laid out, of course. So constraints, height and width, margins, things like that. Transform is how you want to manipulate your views, such as scale, elevation, or like we've set here, rotation and translation. Property set is for alpha, visibility, and progress, and we'll see this later. And finally, motion sub-elements, which we're not going to be using, but that lets you do things related to the transition. Things such as path motion arc, which easily let you add an arc to your transitions, or transition easing, which lets you set an interpolator. So the great thing about these sub-elements is that you only have to define things in your motion scene that will change. So as an example, if we weren't changing the book cover dimensions or the way it's constrained, we could just remove the layout sub-element and just leave the transform sub-element. This keeps the motion scene file much simpler. Before constraint layout alpha 3, you had to define all attributes on the constraint, regardless if they change or not, which could make things get pretty crazy in your file. So that was our start constraint set. Let's take a look at our end constraint set. In our end constraint set, the only difference is that we're no longer constraining to the top, and we've reduced the width to 150 dp. So let's take a quick look. There we go. So now we just need to add in the synopsis card behind the book cover. Nothing crazy here. We add the material card view to our layout above the book color with a color and corner radius. I've set the height and width because you have to, but we won't actually be using them as we'll be using what's in the motion scene. These are the start constraints for the book synopsis card. I've omitted the book cover just so that we can see everything. We set the height and width to 140 dp. We give it a vertical bias of 0.35, which places it slightly higher up the screen. And we set the rotation X to -55. This is the same rotation value that the book cover ends up at the end of the transition. In the end constraint set, we set the height and width to 300 dp. We set the vertical bias to 0.3 so that the synopsis card moves slightly up during the transition. Lastly, we set the rotation to 0 so that it's flat on screen. This is the book cover in the end constraint set. I've made some minor changes to the book cover. I've added the translation Y so that the book cover overlaps the bottom of the synopsis card. I'm also now constraining the book cover to the top of the synopsis card so that it's relative to the synopsis card at the end of the transition. The other thing that has changed that you can't see is I've added elevation to the book cover in the layout. Now, you're going to wonder why you can't see the shadow, and that's because I've not set the outline provider on the image view. If I set the outline provider to be the bounds of the image view, well, let's just take a look. Yeah, it's not very pretty. The rotation on the x-axis is screwing with the shadows for the elevation, and we're going to fix this later. So let's take a look at part 3. There we go. Nicely animating in with the rotation. Cool. Okay, we've got our fancy animating synopsis card, but what good is a fancy animating synopsis card without any synopsis text? So I'm not going to show all the code, but we can add a text view into the layout file and also into the motion scene, and we just constrain it to the bounds of the synopsis card. Then we copy everything we've just done for the synopsis card in the motion scene file, and then just apply that to that text view. And if we run it, it looks pretty terrible. And that's because we constrain the synopsis text to the start and end of the card, and the text spreads as it grows. So we can just fix that by setting the width of the synopsis text to 300 dp, just like the synopsis card. And now it looks way better. I still think we can improve it though. If you looked at the original animation, you might notice that the text fades in partway through the transition. In ours, it starts fading in immediately. Is there something that can help us fix that? Of course there is. Let me introduce you KeyFrames. So normally we use constraint sets to represent final states of our app, in our apps. We have a start and end state right now. You could have states in between, like a middle state. So that's where the scene has, it's where a scene has stopped, so to speak. So we could go start to middle and then middle to end. But what if we only want to change one small thing during our transition? We don't want to have to keep building constraint sets to get all these small changes. And that's where keyframes come in handy. They provide lightweight intermediary steps that your animation or transition can go through. Keyframes can be applied to position or attribute values. There are 5 types of keyframes. Key attributes work on changing an attribute at a certain time. Think of changing the color of a button from white to red at, say, around frame 50. You can also set custom attributes on them, which we're going to see in a bit. Key position allows you to modify the path of a view during the transition. We'll explore this more later. Key time and key time cycle allow us to add some interesting cyclical effects to our animations and transitions using waves. Think of things such as bouncing or shaking. And finally, key trigger allows you to call a function on a widget at a certain time in the animation. For example, calling hide on a floating action button when you're swiping down. So back to our animation. We're going to add a keyframe set, and within that, we're going to add 2 key attributes that do the same thing. One will be for the book synopsis title, one will be for the book synopsis title, and one will be for the book synopsis text. We set the alpha to 0, This means that when the animation starts, the text will be invisible. We define our frame position as 70, so 70% of the way through the animation. I decided on this after a lot of tweaking. Hopefully, again, if you're doing these sort of complex animations, you'll have a designer on hand to help you. So what this equates to is the following. Keep the text invisible until frame 70. When we hit frame 70, then start animating the alpha from 0 to 1, or invisible to visible. Let's take a look at the result. That is the wrong one. That is the right one. So there you can see the text just fades in right towards the end there. Let's move on to the strange liquidy background in the top left and bottom right of the animation and take a brief stop in animated vector drawable land. So I know this talk is not about animated vector drawables, but we're going to need them to produce this animation. I'm not going to go into great detail on animated vector drawables. There are plenty of blog posts, and if you went to Pierluigi and Jahani's talk yesterday, you would have seen them mentioned. Go check all the things out in the end, and you'll see what you can do. So firstly, I created the start and end SVGs. Then we import them into the shapeshifter.design website to make our animated vector drawable. I'm not going to go into great detail. All you need to know is I used path animations utilizing the start and end of the paths of the images I created. If you have any questions on this, come see me after or just ping me on Twitter. We then export the animated vector drawable and import them into our project, set them on our image views, and use the onAnimation end callbacks to start the appropriate animated vector drawable. Okay, let's take a look at what we got now. Strange liquidy background, everyone's favorite thing. Okay. And that's the end of us creating the first scene of our animation. Let's move on to making the second phase of our animation, where we go from the book cover to the detail view for the book. We're going to leave the first part we created and only take the synopsis card with us for now and create a whole new layout. We're going to do this just to break it down a little and make things easier for us to understand. So let's add the book synopsis card back into our new layout, and this is going to be the starting point for the next scene. In the animation, the synopsis card becomes the header for the details screen, with the text fading out and the rounded corners of the card becoming square. Going from the card to the header is simple enough. In our start constraint set, we'll just reuse the synopsis card from the first scene. In our end constraint set, we constrain the synopsis card to the start, end, and top of the parent, with matched constraints for width and height. We also add a constraint dimension ratio of 16 by 9 to our header, just to keep some nice proportions. So finally, we set the elevation to 8 dp so we can let the text scroll underneath, which we're going to see later. And it looks pretty good. But we forgot about the card corners, so let's go fix them. How can we fix them? We can use a custom attribute. A custom attribute helps when we might be using a specialized widget, like in our case, a material card view. Some widgets may have specialized attributes, so it makes sense that we can specify these ourselves. So not all views have a radius attribute, so that's why we need to specify a custom attribute. Things like rotation apply to a lot of views, so that's why you don't need to set a custom attribute for it. We can use any attribute as long as there is a getter and setter prefix for it, and the value type is one of the following: a color value, integer, float, string, dimension, or boolean. If you set a custom attribute, you must set it in both the start and the end constraint set. If you remember, I mentioned that key attributes can also take a custom attribute. So you can use any I just mentioned to change something at a certain frame. So in our start constraint set, we can set a custom attribute on the radius and set the initial value to 16 dp. Remember, this will be used over any value that you set in your layout. And this has tripped me up way too many times, so I'm going to keep repeating it throughout this presentation. In our end constraint set, we just set it to 0 dp to get the square corners. So let's go look at the first part of our second scene. Just one more time. Cool. Okay, moving on. Let's go back and get the book cover back in and get that animating alongside the synopsis card. As you can see, the book cover animates over the top of the synopsis card and there's a shadow. So we're going to go back and fix those shadow issues that we had earlier. So we can steal the constraint sets from the end of scene 1 for our book cover and put them in our start constraint set for scene 2. Next, we can add back in the 4 dp elevation so that we ensure the book cover stays over the top of the book synopsis card. We can also use a custom attribute. So we set the outline spot shadow color, which does the shadow, to transparent, so we get the elevation but not the shadow. Now I tried to set the outline ambient shadow color as well, which is responsible for setting the shadow that comes at about 45 degrees down from the top of the screen to the bottom, so a bit like that. I always got an array out of bounds issue when I tried to do it. Luckily though, you can't really see it, I can't really see it, so does it really matter? For me, no, we can move on and carry on being productive. This is our end constraint set. We set the book cover outline spot shadow color back to black so that we can then see the shadow at the end of the transition. And we can increase the elevation to 12 dp so that the book cover sits on top of the header. So let's have a look at part 2 for our scene. There we go, you see the book cover animating in nicely over the top. Let's add the text back in for the synopsis card. If we look at the original animation, we can see that the text fades out just after the tap, as the synopsis card moves to the top. Now, what have we used so far that can help us do an animation at a certain position? Key attributes. So we just add in our keyframe set to our transition like before, target the synopsis and target the synopsis title and text, set the frame position to 10 and set the alpha to 0. This means that the text alpha will start reducing from 1 to 0 from the first frame of the animation to the 10th frame. After the 10th frame, the text will be gone, so we won't see it anymore. In our start scene, we add the synopsis title and text, making sure we set the elevation. Otherwise, the text will disappear as the synopsis card's elevation increases. In the end scene, we set the elevation for the synopsis title and text to the same as the synopsis card, so we ensure we see the text fading. We also need to set the alpha to 0. Why? Because if we don't, after frame 10, the text will start fading back in, as by not setting the alpha, we'll get the default alpha, which is 1. So let's take a look at part 3. There we go, text fading out. Next, let's add all in the text in the top right-hand corner where the rating stars are as well. Now, in the original animation, the text is always there and exposed when the synopsis card animates over the top of it. We're going to do something a little simpler and have it slide and fade in from the right. The slide part is pretty simple. In our layout, we constrain all the items to the end of the book cover and to the end of the parent. This means that when the book cover animates to the top left of the screen, the items will move towards it from the right. We'll see this in a minute. Why translation y equals 24? Well, because in our design, the book cover is overlapping the header and the white space. So we had to, for that reason, we had to translate it. This means that anything that wants to reference the top of that view is also going to have to be translated as well, if you wanted to keep it in line. We can approach the ratings fade in the way we did for the synopsis card text earlier. It's just that in this case, we're going to be, sorry, fade out if we did for the synopsis text earlier. It's just in this case, we're going to be doing fading in. In our start constraint set, we set all the items alpha to 0. So they're invisible at the start, and then we set the alpha to 1 in our end constraint set so that they're going to be visible. We set the frame position to 95. As we have the initial alpha set to 0 in our start constraint set, this key attribute ensures that nothing will change until frame 95, at which point we'll get the fade starting from 0 to 1. Now, if we run this, we'd have an issue. The fluid animation in the bottom right is still black, which means we wouldn't be able to see the rating quantity text. Now, we can't use MotionLayout to do this, as the the image views that contain the fluid animations are within a material card view. And the key point to this is that MotionLayout can only operate on its direct children. But MotionLayout has a transition listener that we can use to listen for progress during our transition and change the color ourselves. It has 4 callbacks: on transition trigger, on transition started, on transition change, and on transition completed, which I think are all pretty self-explanatory. We're going to be using the on transition change method as we need to know the progress of the animation to animate a new white color in so that we can see the text properly. In the on transition change callback, we create our color using the handy color utils set alpha component method. The first parameter it takes is a color, in our case, white. We then calculate the alpha that we should be using the progress of the animation so that the white will fade in gradually. Then we set each animation's color filter using our color and Porter Duff mode. We use a top so that the white color gets applied on top of the original black. To get a clearer knowledge of the Porter Duff modes, there's a great page on the Android Docs website that is linked at the end. So let's take a look at part 4. You can see there the text fading in nicely. Text fading in nicely? No, the color fading in nicely. Moving on. Now onto the favorite bookmark and red buttons. As you can see, the buttons arrive in a staggered fashion and fade in as well. There's nothing particularly interesting about the buttons in the layout, so I'm not going to show you. It's just 2 floating action buttons and an extended floating action button from the Material Design Components library, chained together using constraints. Nothing crazy here if you've been using constraint layout. So this is our start constraint set for the buttons. Notice we've set the alpha to 0, much like the detailed text we talked about earlier. It's the same in the end constraint set, except that we set the alpha to 1. Again, just like the detailed text. Remember, we have to define the constraints for these buttons in our end constraint set, even if it's only the alpha that's changing. We're going to be following a similar pattern to how we faded the header text earlier, using key attributes, except the frame position that the fade happens in is going to increase with each button in a staggered fashion. There's part 5 of scene 2. And the buttons arrive in. But I still think there's an issue. Let's take a look at a slowed down version and just focus on the buttons. Can anyone see an issue compared to the original animation? So let's just do it again. I'm going to turn on a really handy feature of MotionLayout called Debug Paths. So yeah, the buttons don't animate in straight. They animate in diagonally. Well, straight from bottom to top, sorry. That's because they are constrained to the book cover, which at the start is in the center. So the buttons are pushed over to the right. How did I see those paths? Well, MotionLayout provides a really useful motion debug attribute, which I set to show path, which, as it says, shows you the path of the views during the animation. There's also show progress, which will give you the progress of your animation, the current state, and also the frames per second. Or you can turn both paths and progress on with the attribute show all. So right, let's get back to fixing the fact that the buttons animate in diagonally and not straight from the beneath them to the top. We're going to focus on the favorite button because whatever we do for the favorite button, we're going to basically copy for the others. So there's a keyframe type that I mentioned earlier that we've not used yet called key position. Key position is going to allow us to modify the paths of the button at a certain frame. Now, key position has a lot of attributes with a lot of values. I don't want to overwhelm you, and I don't have the time, so we're just going to go through what I've set with a little bit of explanation. Again, the Medium posts at the end have lots of detail, lots of great diagrams, and lots of animations that will make this a lot clearer. Curve fit determines the interpolation curve that applies to the keyframe. We're using linear rather than the default spline. Spline is normally better because it provides a smoother transition. Frame position we've seen before. We're applying ours at 0, as we want to move the button in a straight line direct to its end position at the start of the transition. Now we have %x and position type. %x allows us to express our favorite button's position in adaptive terms. We don't have the power of the constraint layout. Constraint layout system, in the keyframe. So making them adaptive means we can more easily adjust to screen orientation or different density of devices. %x is directly affected by the key position type, which reflects a coordinate system. We're going to go into the weeds a little bit here, but just bear with me. We're using delta relative, which determines its coordinate system by using the start and end of a widget's position. There's also parent relative, which is based on the parent's dimensions, which typically, if you had a full motion layout with a full screen, that would normally be a parent, but obviously it could be smaller depending on the size of your motion layout. Finally, path relative determines its coordinate system based on a direct line between the start and end position of a widget. But you can forget about those last two for now. Let's go back to what we're using, delta relative. We're setting our %x to 1 because we want our buttons to move to their end x, which puts them in a straight line directly beneath their end position. If, for example, we put our %x to 2, we get something similar to this. In essence, we've doubled the x distance we'd normally move to get directly below our end position. As you can see, the percent and key position types can open up some powerful tools to make in some complex movements during our animations and transitions. Okay, back to our key position. Our target is the favorite button. And we're applying transition easing. We're using a decelerate interpolator provided to us by MotionLayout, so the buttons slow down towards the end. Other provided interpolators are linear and accelerate. So now all we have to do is just repeat this for the bookmark and red buttons, and we're done. So as you can see in the paths, we have all our buttons moving in directly straight line below their respective end positions. But we're still not done though, they're not staggering in. An easy way to fix that is just to offset our buttons. We can do that by setting a translation Y on all our buttons using key attributes. This means that when we get to frame 80, our favorite button is going to move down 24 dp and then start fading in as it finally reaches the end state. We can do this for the other buttons just with a larger translation Y so we get that staggered effect. Let's take a look at it now. Part 6. You see them all staggering in. One more time. The last thing we need to do is add in the scrollable list below the header. In the layout, the list is just a couple of material card views that are wrapped with a scroll view, so I'm not going to show you that. The setup in the start constraint set is nothing new that we haven't seen already. We set the alpha to 0 so it's not visible, and constrain the list to the bottom of the parent so that it's off screen. In the end constraint set, we constrain the list to the bottom of the book cover so that it's offset slightly from the header, so that when the text comes in, it's not directly underneath that book cover, which is over the header and the white space. We also constrain to the bottom of the parent so that we fill the whole of the screen. Lastly, we add a key attribute to start fading the list in at frame 50, so it starts fading in midway through our transition, moving to underneath the header. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. There we go. And it's scrollable. One more time, because I spent a long time. Cool. And we're pretty much done now. All we need to do now is combine the scenes together by merging both our layouts and combining both our motion scenes. We only need 3 constraint sets for the combined scene with transitions to trigger the transitions between them. Transitions to trigger the transition between them. Yeah, that's a tongue twister. We need 1 transition when we swipe down to show the synopsis card. This transition is going from the start constraint set to the middle constraint set. The other transition is where we click the synopsis card and go to the book detail screen. This transition is going from the middle constraint set to the end constraint set. So let's take a look at these combined scenes. And then we can add a bit more into the start scene and make it look a little bit nicer. Again, not using anything that we haven't used so far. And we can go even crazier and add in the books on the left and right and have them disappear and then have their cards and keep going. And then we can have a funny one, or maybe a funny one. Anyone read this book? I haven't. From the reviews, it doesn't look that great either. 3 stars. Ah. This guy gets around, doesn't he? Okay. So there are a few niggly issues I had with combining the swipe handler, which does the start to middle, and the click handler that does the middle to end. I could get all the way to the end to the details part, but then when I got back to the middle, the swipe handler no longer registered. So just in there, I was using a click handler from the start to the middle. Not as nice, but hopefully this will get fixed later. And I've also used some custom attributes to fix the elevation issues and lack of shadows. I used them in the constraint sets, and I also used them in KeyFrames, ensuring that they faded correctly. You can check this out in the code on the repo. So what are the considerations you should be thinking about when you deciding whether you're going to use MotionLayout or whether you're going to try? So firstly, we have no GUI yet, which is a bit tough. Things can get really crazy in your XML motion scene, but this is in progress. Just they're working on the Android Studio Project Marble, I believe. So hopefully once that's all finished up, we might see it. It doesn't work with recycler views right now, and this is one of the big pain points. You saw the books on either side, but you couldn't swipe to them. Now I know I could probably make that work with code. I didn't want to. But obviously that means that couldn't be endless until that's fixed. If you go look at a video from Droidcon recently, Nicholas Roy demoed this, and I'm really looking forward to when they add this in. It's in alpha, right? So things can break. As we saw from alpha 2 to alpha 3, the APIs can change. And while I think it's fine for your side projects or small projects, you've got to take this into consideration when using it in production. Like, I'm using it in my side project, but I haven't released yet, and I have about 20 users. I think there's a possibility if you got too complex, you could run into performance issues. And I'm talking about super crazy animations with loads of loads of things moving everywhere and all that crazy stuff. So here's a video of the most complex animation that I had there, running on a HTC One M7 from 2013 on Lollipop. The frames per second hovers around 30, so it looks okay. I tried using Glide, but I didn't make any other attempts to optimize this. As previously mentioned, hopefully Recycler View will alleviate some of these issues. And you've got to remember as well, right, I've got animated vector durables running, vector durables, and there's also a lot of views. But On my Pixel 3, it runs perfect at 60 frames per second. So just buy a new device, right? That fixes everything. Okay, it's not really a motion layout thing, but I wanted to just mention that the things I was doing with the shadows fading, that's only available in API 28, because that's when it was added the ability to change them. So that's just something else, like you're not going to get that, not going to be able to change that elevation shadow on older versions. Lastly, I found it is really difficult to have transitions on the same target. So when I went from the middle with the synopsis card to the end, you then have the book cover. And what would be really nice is if you could click the book cover and go back to the middle. But the book cover is like registered, so to speak, for the start to the middle. So you couldn't do it. I'm sure you could probably do it in code. I didn't have time, so I spent all my time doing this presentation. But hopefully, I can have a look at it later and maybe I can sort it. So hopefully you managed to keep up with me. It's been a lot, I realize, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's still lots of stuff I didn't talk about, like the, the key time cycles and key cycles, which can open up some crazy stuff with waves. There's plenty more for you to explore on your own, and I hope you realize just how powerful and useful motion layout is going to be for us all. So if you're going to get started, my recommendations are the following. Start out simple. Something like the swiping behavior I had at the start, from the book cover to the middle state, that's how I started on a Sunday, and this is what I ended up with. If you want to implement it in an existing project, it might be easy for you to start up a new empty project, do all your animation work there, and then come back, because it can get quite crazy. Go and read the blog post by Nicholas Roard. They are really detailed, really useful, and don't be afraid to ask them questions on Twitter. They've answered a lot of my questions on Twitter, and just remember to use the tag motion layout so you alert them, or just target them directly. Don't go to their house though. Throughout the development of this talk, I've been using the new apply changes in Android Studio. I think it's in the RC right now for 4. I can't remember, 4? I've been using the Canary version because I'm bold like that. It's been fine for me, and it's really good in this to make those quick changes. It's nothing like the old instant run. Don't be afraid of it. I've also used it in my own app, and it's been great there. I've only had a few tiny issues, but nothing that you don't normally see with Android Studio, right? And finally, just have fun. Like, go onto Dribbble, explore all these animations, pick one out that you like, and just try it. That's what I did. Just find something crazy and play with it. But wait. What does every speaker not want to hear on the day of their presentation? Any ideas? Oh yeah, the library you're talking about has been updated and things have changed. Please take a moment to take a photo of this slide, I'm serious, and send it to Nicholas Roard and John Hawford on Twitter, because I'm sure they would really like to hear about it from everyone here. I'm sure they don't want like 200 notifications. Oh, it's not 200 of you, I'm way too bold there. So, I woke up this morning and my friend messaged me and said, did you know Constraint Layout Alpha 4 has been released? And I was like, oh, great. So it includes some bug fixes, it probably fixes some issues that I was going to talk to you about, but I've left them out because they might be fixed. It fixes some changes to attribute names. There's new richer behaviors for setting on click, amongst other things. So I fully intend to update the repo because I've got another talk soon, and so I'm going to have to update it for that. So just keep an eye on the GitHub repo, and yeah, everything should be sorted. Thank you very much.